Clara Whitmore slammed the wooden spoon down on the cutting board so hard that every cowboy in the kitchen went dead silent. I said no. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't shake. She looked straight at the man twice her size, who had just told her that a woman like her had no business standing behind a stove on a real working ranch. And she didn't blink. "You got something to say about my cooking," she told him. "You say it to my face. But you don't say it like that. Not ever again." The kitchen held its breath. And somewhere near the back wall, the man everyone called Ben, the quiet one, the one who never spoke unless he had to, slowly set down his coffee cup and watched her with eyes that had not looked that alive in a very long time. If this story already has your attention, I want to ask you something before we go any further. Please take just a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And when you leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement had been pinned to the post office board in Millhaven, Montana for 11 days before Clara Whitmore pulled it down and folded it into her coat pocket. She read it 3 times standing in the cold. Cook needed. Black River Ranch. Remote location. 20 men. Long hours. Honest pay. Apply in person. Ask for the foreman. She had been applying for work for 6 weeks. The hotel in town told her they preferred someone with a more refined appearance. The boarding house told her the work was too physical for a woman of her build. The schoolhouse said she lacked the proper credentials. And the dress shop owner, a thin woman with sharp eyes who looked her up and down in 4 seconds flat, told her kindly, with a smile that wasn't kind at all, that she didn't think Clara would be comfortable on her feet all day. Clara had thanked each of them. Politely. Calmly. Then she walked outside and stood in the cold air and let herself feel it. That particular kind of humiliation that wasn't loud, wasn't violent, but settled into your chest like a stone and stayed there. The kind that came from being seen and then immediately dismissed. The kind that made you wonder if they were right. She was 25 years old. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with strong hands and a face that showed everything she felt, whether she wanted it to or not. She had been told her whole life, in ways subtle and direct, that her body made her worth less, that her size was a problem to be apologized for, that people had to look past it to see anything good in her, and most people didn't bother looking past anything. She was not stupid. She knew what they saw when she walked into a room. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to find out, was what she had learned in 25 years of surviving people like them. She had learned to read a kitchen the way a general reads a battlefield. She had learned to stretch 4 pounds of flour into 3 days of bread without a single crumb going to waste. She had learned to manage supplies for a household of 12 during a winter when the roads were closed for 6 weeks. She had learned patience, the real kind. Not the quiet kind that means accepting whatever you're handed. The kind that means you wait, you watch, you understand the problem completely, and then you act. But none of that had mattered in Millhaven, because none of the people who turned her away had asked her a single question about any of it. She unfolded the advertisement again. 20 men. Remote location. Long hours. She thought about her savings. $11.40. She thought about the room at the boarding house she was renting week to week. She thought about the way her landlady had started looking at her lately, like she was already doing the math on how long before Clara couldn't pay. She put the advertisement back in her pocket and walked to the livery stable to ask about getting out to Black River Ranch. The stable hand told her it was 14 miles out. "You sure you want to go all the way out there, ma'am?" he said, not unkindly, but with the particular kind of doubt men used when they thought they were being helpful. "It's rough country. The outfit's been through 4 cooks this season." "I'm sure," Clara said. He arranged for a wagon going that direction the following morning, driven by a feed supplier making a delivery. Clara paid him a quarter, went back to her room, packed everything she owned into one worn leather suitcase, and spent the evening sitting on the edge of her bed, making a list of every possible problem she might face in an unfamiliar kitchen. She made herself write down the solutions too. That was the discipline she had built over years of being in difficult situations, You didn't just name what was wrong. You figured out what you were going to do about it before the crisis arrived. She arrived at Black River Ranch the following afternoon. She heard the noise before she saw the building. The sound of men's voices, cattle in the distance, horses shifting in a pen, the rhythmic clang of something metallic being struck somewhere behind the main structure. The ranch was large, larger than she expected. There were multiple outbuildings, a sizable main house, fencing that stretched out in both directions farther than she could see from the wagon. The land itself had the look of something that had once been very well managed and was currently in the middle of being argued about. The feed supplier set her bags down at the gate and drove off. Clara stood there for a moment. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked to the front door and knocked. The man who opened it was tall and lean, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock as the mountains behind him. He was wearing a plain shirt, old trousers, and a hat that had clearly spent years in the sun. He had dark eyes that didn't give much away, and when he looked at her, he did what most people did. He registered her size first. There was a fraction of a second. She had learned to clock it precisely, where his eyes moved over her and made a calculation. Then he looked at her face. "I'm here about the cook position," Clara said. She kept her voice level. "I saw the advertisement in Millhaven." "You have experience?" he asked. 12 years, she said. "I cooked for a household of 12 through 2 Wyoming winters. Before that, I worked a cattle drive kitchen out of Colorado for 1 season, 83 men. Before that, I ran the kitchen at a mining camp in the hills outside of Bozeman for 18 months. She didn't pause between those facts. She'd learned not to. People who hesitated while listing their qualifications left room for interruption, and interruption was where the doubt got in. The man looked at her for a moment. "Name?" he said. "Clara Whitmore." "I'm Ben," he said. "Come in." That was all. No more scrutiny about her size. No joke. No comment wrapped in politeness. Just, "Come in." She followed him inside. The kitchen was in a state that told a story the moment she stepped into it. She didn't need anyone to explain what had happened. She could read it herself. The stove had soot around the left burner that suggested a recurring smoke problem, probably a flue that needed cleaning. The flour bin had been left open, and moisture had gotten in at some point. She could see the faint discoloration at the sides. The pantry door was open, and the shelving arrangement made no logical sense, organized by what appeared to be size of container rather than frequency of use, which meant every cook who'd worked here had spent 3 times as long hunting for basic ingredients as they should have. She counted the shelves. She counted the pots. She found the meat safe and checked the supplies. Bun stood in the doorway and watched her. She turned around. "You're feeding 20 men." 22, he said. "As of last week. You're short on salt pork. You've got enough for maybe 10 days at current rate of use. Your flour has some moisture damage, not severe, but you'll want to work through the affected portions first. And your stove flue needs cleaning. It's not urgent, but if you leave it through winter, you'll have smoke in the kitchen every time the wind shifts." He was quiet for a moment. "Previous cook didn't mention any of that," he said. "I imagine the previous cook was too busy dealing with the results to identify the cause," she said. Something moved in his expression. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was more like recognition. "Wages are $15 a month," he said. "Room and board included. Sunday afternoons are yours if the work is caught up." "I'll need a budget for supplies," Clara said. "And I'd like to see the account of what's been spent on food for the last 2 months before I agree to anything." He looked at her for a long moment. "Most people just say yes to the wages," he said. "Most people aren't trying to manage 22 men on whatever's left over after poor ordering," Clara said. "If you want me to do this job well, I need to know what I'm working with. If you want someone who'll just say yes and be quiet, I'm probably not the right fit." Another silence. I went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen, a small thing, covered in papers, and pulled out a ledger. He handed it to her. She spent 5 minutes reading it. The spending was inconsistent. Large orders placed irregularly, with no apparent logic to the timing. Duplicated items in consecutive orders. Shortfalls in staples. The whole pattern spoke of someone cooking by instinct and crisis rather than by planning. "I can work with this," Clara said. "But I'll need to restructure the ordering schedule, and I'll need your support when I make changes the men don't immediately like, because the first 2 weeks are going to look like less before they look like more." "What kind of changes?" Ben asked. "Portion management," she said. "Not starvation rations, real portioning. Right now there's food going to waste every meal because nobody's thought carefully about quantities. If I manage it correctly, the men eat just as well, and you spend 15% less, possibly 20. He looked at her the way people looked at a card player who just laid down an unexpected hand. "You've done this before," he said. "Several times," Clara said. "All right," he said. "You've got the job. The men eat at 6 in the morning, 12 noon, and 6 in the evening. They'll tell you their preferences. Ignore most of them." She almost smiled at that. "When do I meet them?" she said. "Tonight," Ben said. 6 o'clock. He turned to leave. "Mr. Ben," she said. He stopped. "I appreciate the opportunity," she said. "I want you to know I don't take it lightly." He turned and looked at her once more. "I don't give opportunities lightly," he said. "Don't waste it." Then he was gone. Clara stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. She set her suitcase down. She took off her coat. She rolled up her sleeves, and she went back to the pantry and started reorganizing the shelves in the correct order. The men arrived at 6 o'clock. There were 22 of them, and they came through the door of the main house in a cluster, loud, tired, smelling of cattle and leather and outdoor labor, the way men who worked land always smelled. They pulled off their hats as they came in, mostly out of habit, and then they saw her standing at the head of the serving table. The noise dropped. Not immediately. It took about 3 seconds, traveling through the room like a slow wave, as each man registered her size, her gender, her presence in this kitchen, and did his own quick calculation about what it meant. She had served hundreds of men over her career. She knew the calculation. She let them finish it. Then she said, clearly and without apology, "I'm Clara Whitmore. I'm your new cook. Supper's on the table. Sit down." A few of them looked at each other. A man near the front, big, red-faced, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told he was wrong, let his eyes travel over her slowly and deliberately. His name, she would learn later, was Doyle. He was the senior hand, had been on the ranch longer than anyone else, and had apparently held a very high opinion of himself for most of that time. "Well," Doyle said, with the kind of smile that was meant to be shared with the men around him, "I see they finally found us someone who knows her way around a plate of food." Several men laughed. Clara looked at him. She had heard 1,000 versions of that joke. She had heard it from men who thought they were being funny, and men who knew they were being cruel, and men who genuinely couldn't tell the difference. She had learned over years how to read which kind she was dealing with and what it meant for the situation going forward. Doyle was the kind who needed an audience. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was a man who had found that making people laugh gave him status, and he'd never learned to be careful about who paid the price for that status. She kept her expression entirely neutral. "The biscuits are on the left," she said. "Gravy's in the center. I'd recommend eating while it's hot." And she turned back to the stove. After a beat of silence, she heard chairs scraping on the floor as the men sat down. She heard the sounds of food being served. And then, quietly but unmistakably, she heard the sound of appreciation. The low, involuntary sounds men made when food was genuinely good, as distinct from the sounds they made when they were just filling their stomachs, because she had made the kind of supper that required real skill and attention to produce. Not fancy food. Nothing complicated. But she had done everything right. The timing, the seasoning, the texture of the biscuits, the weight of the gravy. She'd had less than 4 hours with that kitchen and those supplies, and she had produced a meal that was, without question, the best thing those men had eaten in weeks. She knew it. And slowly, around that table, they were figuring it out too. Doyle didn't say anything else. Not because he was chastened. Because his mouth was full. Ben came in at 6:15. He sat at the far end of the table. She noticed he didn't take the head, didn't assert any particular position. He sat like a man who was comfortable wherever he was. He served himself. He ate. She watched him, carefully and without appearing to. I was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who didn't see the need to say things that weren't necessary. He listened more than he spoke. When one of the men said something at his end of the table, he would respond briefly, consider whatever was said, nod or disagree with equal economy of expression. He had the kind of stillness that made other people want to fill it. She recognized it because she'd spent years cultivating a similar thing. When the men had finished and begun to push back from the table, one of them, a younger hand, maybe 19, with an earnest face and red ears, stopped near the kitchen doorway. "That was real good, ma'am," he said. "I mean it. Best meal we've had in a while." "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" "Henry," he said. "Henry Oakes." "Thank you, Henry," she said. "Breakfast is at 6 sharp. Don't be late." He grinned and ducked out. She began clearing the table. Bun was the last one left. He was still sitting at the end of the table, not eating, just holding his coffee cup. "Well," she said, because she'd learned that silences with this particular kind of man didn't resolve themselves without a nudge. "You're better than you let on during the interview," he said. "I didn't let on anything," she said. "I told you exactly what I could do." "Fair," he said. She kept stacking plates. "The men will test you," he said. "Not all of them, but some. You should know that going in." "I do know that going in," she said. "Doyle specifically," he said. "He's been the informal leader of the table since before I can remember. He doesn't like things that disrupt the order he's used to." "I noticed," she said. "He's manageable." Ben looked at her over his coffee cup. "You think so?" "He needs an audience to be difficult," she said. "And he responds to competence. If the food stays good, he'll quiet down. Men like Doyle want to be comfortable. I can make them comfortable. That's a tool." Another silence. "You're not what I expected," Ben said. "I'm exactly what I said I was in the interview," Clara said. "Yeah," he said. He set down his coffee cup and stood. "That's what I mean." He said goodnight and left. Clara finished the dishes. She stood in the kitchen alone after the last one was put away, listening to the ranch settle into its evening sounds. She had a job. She had a room. She had 22 men to feed 3 times a day, and an organizational problem to solve, and a budget to restructure. She was not safe yet. She knew that. Nothing was decided in the first day. The judgment that mattered wasn't the immediate approval of a good meal. It was the slower, harder evaluation of sustained competence, of showing up every day and being exactly what she said she was. But she was here. That was enough for tonight. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to find her room. Over the next 2 weeks, she made herself indispensable so quietly and methodically that most of the men didn't realize it was happening until it was already done. She restructured the pantry on day 2. She reorganized the supply ordering on day 4. She cleaned the stove flue on day 6, herself, because she wasn't going to ask men to do something on her behalf before she'd proven she wasn't afraid of the difficult work herself. She was covered in soot when she finished, standing in the yard with a cleaning brush and a face that probably looked a state, and when Henry Oakes walked past and saw her, he stopped dead. "Ma'am," he said, with the particular alarm of a young man encountering a situation he had not prepared for. "It was smoking," she said simply. "It's done now." He stared at her for another second, then apparently decided the correct response was to offer help 2 minutes too late. Do you need—" "I'm finished," she said. "But thank you." He helped her carry the cleaning equipment back inside. He talked while they walked, nervously, filling the silence the way young people did when they were uncertain. And she listened, because she'd found that listening was one of the most useful skills she possessed. Henry was 17, not 19 as she'd initially thought. He'd come from Missouri. He'd been on the ranch 8 months, which made him the second newest hand after herself. He admired the senior hands but wasn't entirely sure they respected him. He was worried about whether he was going to be kept on when the season changed. She filed all of that away. Because knowing what people were worried about was the beginning of knowing how to work with them. The food quality remained high. Consistently, relentlessly, without variation for weather or difficult supply days, or the mornings when she'd been up since 4 because something needed advanced preparation. She treated every meal like it mattered, because it did. Not for the abstract reason that people deserved good food, but for the practical reason that men who ate well worked better, argued less, and were more willing to give credit where it was due. Doyle remained the friction point, not dramatically. He wasn't cruel in the direct way she'd feared initially. He was subtler than that. The comment dropped at just the right moment to get a laugh from the men nearest him. The complaint raised when she changed something. The eye roll visible enough to signal his opinion to the room without being explicit enough to be confronted. She didn't confront him. She watched him. On the 11th day, she noticed that he was eating more than anyone else at the table, not just at meals, but between them. She found evidence in the kitchen of food being taken outside regular mealtimes. Not theft exactly, more like a habit, the kind of thing that developed when no one was tracking carefully. She changed the system, not dramatically. She simply made the portions and timing such that there was always enough food at mealtimes. But the informal between-meal rating became impossible without being confronted. She did it without mentioning it, without addressing Doyle directly, without making an issue. 3 days later, he stopped, and a week after that, he started doing something she hadn't expected. He started defending her. She overheard it in the yard, a conversation between Doyle and 2 hands she didn't know well, one of whom had apparently made a comment about her that crossed some line Doyle had decided, quietly and without announcement, existed. "You don't know what you're talking about," Doyle said, with the flat certainty of a man who had changed his mind about something and wasn't going to explain the process. She didn't make anything of it. She didn't mention it to him. She didn't thank him. She just kept doing her work. Ben watched all of this. She didn't know exactly how much he watched, but she suspected it was more than she was aware of. He had a way of appearing in peripheral moments, at the edge of the kitchen doorway, when she was explaining to Henry how to properly store root vegetables, at the far end of the yard when she was speaking to the supply delivery man about the order schedule, at the back of the room during the one heated exchange she'd had with 2 of the hands about the midday meal timing. He never intervened. That was the interesting part. He watched. He let things play out. He trusted, or appeared to trust, that the situation would resolve itself. She respected that more than she'd expected to. The moment that changed something, though she couldn't have identified it precisely at the time, came on a Thursday in the 3rd week. A storm moved through overnight. Not catastrophic, but significant. By morning, it had damaged a section of fencing on the eastern side of the property, and 3 of the men had been sent out to assess while the rest argued in the main house about what it meant. The argument, as she listened to it while managing breakfast service, was not really about the fence. It was about a broader problem. A section of land on the eastern boundary that had been producing poorly for 2 seasons and was now, with additional fence damage, looking like a liability rather than an asset. Several of the senior hands wanted to pull resources away from it. The argument in the room was about whether that was practical or whether it created more problems than it solved. Clara served eggs. She listened. She had been listening to these men talk about this ranch for 3 weeks. She had been doing the supply math. She had been watching where the resources went and where they were short. She knew something about the eastern section that the men arguing apparently didn't. She waited until the argument reached a natural pause, the kind that happened when everyone had said their position and no one had moved anyone. Then she said, from her position at the stove, "If you pull resources from the eastern section, you lose access to the creek bed." Silence. Several men looked at her with the expression she'd become very familiar with, the particular expression of a man who has just remembered a piece of furniture has a mouth. "Creek's seasonal," said one of the senior hands. "It's already run dry by August." "It ran dry in August last year," Clara said. "The year before it ran into October. The difference was rainfall pattern. This spring has been wetter than last." She turned around from the stove. "If you pull resources from the eastern section and the creek runs late this year, you lose 6 weeks of water access for the cattle that graze in that quadrant, which means moving them, which means..." Costs, Ben said, from the back of the room. She hadn't seen him come in. I was standing just inside the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. Which means costs, she confirmed. More than the fence repair would be. The room was very quiet. How do you know how long the creek ran 2 years ago? Doyle asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. I asked the supply driver, she said. He comes out this way twice a month. He's been doing it for 7 years. He remembers things about the land. More silence. She's right about the cost projection, Ben said. He said it quietly, simply, without emphasis, but it landed in the room with considerable weight. I've run those numbers myself. The fence repair is the cheaper option. And that was it. The argument ended. The men began finishing their breakfast, and Clara turned back to the stove and filled the next plate and said nothing more about it. But she felt it, the shift in the room. Something had moved, not loudly, not with ceremony, but definitely. Later, after the breakfast dishes were done and the kitchen was empty, Ben appeared in the doorway again. That was well done, he said. The eggs? She said. The other thing, he said. She turned around. I just said what I knew. I know, he said. That's what made it well done. She looked at him for a moment. He was leaning against the doorframe, in the same easy, apparently effortless way he occupied every space he was in. Like he was comfortable in his own body, in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval of it. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead, he said. Why do you sit at the far end of the table? You could sit anywhere. It's your... She almost said your ranch. The foreman's position is usually at the head. I was quiet for a second. I can see more from the far end, he said. She considered that. Fair enough, she said. He pushed off the doorframe and turned to leave. Mr. Ben, she said. He stopped. The creek information, she said. I didn't just ask the supply driver because I was curious. I asked because I thought it might matter eventually. I've been asking questions about this ranch since I arrived. I hope that's all right. He turned back and looked at her for a long moment. That's not just all right, he said. That's exactly right. And he left. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone. She thought about the way he'd said that. Not as a compliment exactly, as a statement of fact. The same way he'd said everything else, directly, without ornamentation, without any apparent need to be liked for saying it. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her that way. Not kindly, not unkindly, but simply as if she was exactly what she was, and that was not a problem. She had 3 more meals to prepare before the day was over. She went back to work. The shift happened so gradually that Clara almost missed the moment it became real. Almost. She had been at Black River Ranch for exactly 4 weeks when she walked into the main house one morning and found 3 of the senior hands already at the table before breakfast was ready, not waiting to eat, but waiting to talk to her. That had never happened before. Doyle was there. So was a quiet man named Garrett, who worked the cattle on the north section and had never said more than 6 words to her in a row. And there was Pete, the oldest hand on the ranch, a lean, weathered man somewhere in his late 50s, who had a habit of watching everything from under the brim of his hat before he decided whether something was worth his attention. She had earned Pete's attention approximately 8 days in, when she had figured out without being told that he couldn't eat anything with too much salt on account of a heart condition he'd never mentioned to anyone. She'd just noticed that he always ate less than everyone else, and that he winced slightly after certain meals. She'd adjusted his portions quietly without making a thing of it. He'd never said a word about it to her directly, but she'd caught him once, looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude. Pete seemed like a man who didn't do gratitude easily, but was something close to it, something like acknowledgement. So when she walked in that morning and found all 3 of them sitting at the table before 6 o'clock, she didn't show her surprise. She set down the pan she was carrying and said, "Coffee's not ready yet." "That's all right," Doyle said. He had his hat on the table in front of him, which she'd learned meant he was treating the conversation as serious. "We wanted to talk to you before the others got here." She looked at him. About? Doyle and Garrett exchanged a look. Pete just watched. "There's a man coming out from town this week," Doyle said. "A buyer, Harrison Blake. He's been circling this ranch for 2 seasons now, trying to get Ben to sell off the eastern section." Clara was very still. "And?" "And last time he came, things got complicated," Garrett said. "I was a man of few words, Garrett, so when he chose to use them, it tended to mean something." There were 3 hands who sided with Blake's position without fully understanding what they were agreeing to. 2 of them aren't on the ranch anymore. "Blake's good at making his offers sound reasonable," Pete said, from under his hat brim. It was the longest sentence she'd heard from him. "What does this have to do with me?" Clara said. Doyle looked at her steadily. "You know the numbers on this ranch better than any of us. You've been running the supply budget for 4 weeks, and I'd bet my wages you've got a clearer picture of what this property actually costs to operate than half the men who've been here for years." She didn't confirm or deny that, but she didn't look away either. "Blake is going to come in here with a proposal," Doyle said. "He always does. He'll make the eastern section sound like a burden, fence trouble, low yield, the creek problem. He's going to make letting it go sound like good business." "And you want me to what?" Clara said. "I'm the cook. I don't have a seat at whatever table that conversation happens at." "Not officially," Pete said quietly. "But you've got ears. And you've got numbers. And Ben listens to you more than he listens to most." The room was very still. Clara set her pan down on the counter and turned fully toward the 3 of them. "Ben listens to whoever makes a sound argument," she said carefully. "That doesn't mean he takes direction from me. That's not what this is." "We're not asking you to direct him," Doyle said. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something in his face that looked genuinely worried. "We're asking you to make sure he has the right information before Blake gets to him." "And you think he doesn't have it already?" she said. Another exchange of looks between Doyle and Garrett. "There's something Blake knows that he hasn't made public," Garrett said. "About the eastern section, about the water. Rumor is he's been talking to the county land office about a drainage project that would reroute the creek. If he gets that land, he could change the water access for half the valley." Clara felt the information land with a specific kind of weight. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Ben 3 days earlier, about the creek. About the supply driver's 7 years of observations. About the fact that she had already been thinking about that water access more carefully than she'd let anyone know. "How reliable is the rumor?" she said. "Reliable enough that 2 ranchers on the other side of the valley have already hired a lawyer," Pete said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to see Ben's map of the eastern boundary. The detailed one, not the overview." Doyle blinked. "You know about the detailed map?" "I know there's one," she said. "I've seen it rolled up on the desk in the office. I haven't looked at it because it wasn't my business to look at it." She paused. "Is it my business now?" Doyle stood up. "I'll get it." The map was not just a boundary drawing. It was a full survey map with water sources marked. And once Clara spread it on the kitchen table and spent 20 minutes with it, she understood exactly what Harrison Blake was planning and exactly why the eastern section was worth more than anyone had been saying out loud. The creek didn't just run through the eastern section, it originated there. If Blake acquired that land and the county approved his drainage proposal, he wouldn't just affect Black River Ranch. He'd affect the water table for 6 properties. He'd become the single controlling interest in the valley's most critical resource. She stood back from the map. Doyle and Garrett and Pete were watching her. "When does Blake arrive?" she said. "Friday," Doyle said. "All right," she said. She rolled the map back up. "All right," Garrett said. "That's it? Just all right?" "I need 2 days to put together the numbers properly," she said. "In the meantime, nobody says anything to Blake that isn't strictly necessary. No information about water levels, no discussion of the creek timing, no comments about yield in the eastern section, good or bad. Can you manage that?" "We're cowhands, not conversationalists," Pete said, which was so dry she almost smiled. "Good," she said. "Go get breakfast. I'll have it ready in 20 minutes." She turned back to the stove. She heard the three of them moving toward their usual places at the table, and then she heard Doyle say, very quietly, to the other two, "Told you." She kept her face forward and didn't let herself react. But she felt it. The particular sensation of being seen clearly by people who had started out seeing nothing at all. She spent the next 2 days working. She did her regular kitchen work, the meals, the supply management, the ordinary daily operation of feeding 22 men. And alongside it, in the margins of her time, she built a complete picture of what the eastern section was actually worth and what losing control of the creek would actually cost. She used the supply ledgers. She used the map. She used everything the supply driver had told her about seasonal patterns. She asked Pete 3 carefully worded questions about cattle yields in different quadrants of the property over the last 3 years, framing them as casual conversation, and he answered them in the same register, the two of them having a conversation that looked like nothing and was in fact extremely specific. She used a sheet of brown paper from the kitchen supply wrapping to lay out her figures. On the evening of the second day, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the brown paper in front of her when Ben appeared in the doorway. She had been expecting this. She didn't think he'd miss the fact that she'd been doing something extra over the last 2 days. He didn't miss much. "Late night," he said. "Little bit," she said. He came into the kitchen and looked at the paper on the table. He didn't ask. He looked at her and waited. She turned the paper around so he could read it. He was quiet for a long time. "You did this yourself," he said. "With help," she said. "Pete's a better source on yield history than any record you've got in that office, and the supply driver knows this land better than most people who live on it." Bun was still reading. His eyes moved down the figures with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "You know about Blake's drainage proposal," he said. It wasn't a question. "Garrett told me the rumor," she said. "The map confirmed why it would work." Bun set the paper down and looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Thinking about the eastern section?" she said. "Since the storm. You made a comment that day in the discussion that told me you'd already run your own numbers. I figured someone should verify them from a different angle." He looked at her for a long moment. "Nobody asked you to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "It wasn't part of your job," he said. "I know that too," she said. "Do you want me to have not done it?" He was quiet. "No," he said. He picked up the paper again and studied it. "The figures on the water table impact," he said. "Where did you get those?" "Library in Millhaven," she said. "I asked Henry to pick up 2 county survey documents when he went in for supplies last week. I told him I needed them for reference on something for the kitchen. I'm sorry for using him that way." Bun set the paper down again. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not surprised exactly, because she was starting to think very little surprised him, but something more like reassessment. Like a man who had already revised his estimate of something upward and was now revising it again. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "All right," she said. "Blake arrives at 2 o'clock on Friday," he said. "He's bringing his own lawyer." "I know," she said. "Doyle told me." Bond's expression shifted slightly. "Doyle." "He and Garrett and Pete came to me before you were up 4 days ago," she said. "They were worried. They wanted to make sure you had the right information." "And they thought you were the right person to come to," Ben said. "Apparently," she said. He was quiet. She folded her hands on the table. "They trust you," she said. "That's what it is, really. They came to me because they didn't know how to bring this to you without it feeling like they were questioning your judgment. So they found a side door." Something moved in his face. "Through the kitchen." "Through the kitchen," she said. He almost smiled. It was very brief, and it didn't quite fully form, but it was there. "Keep the paper," he said. "I may need it Friday." I took his coffee and left. Clara sat alone in the kitchen with the brown paper in front of her and the lamp burning low. She thought about Friday. She thought about a man named Harrison Blake, who could control the water supply for an entire valley and had apparently decided to do it through acquisition rather than force. She thought about Ben's face when he'd read her figures, not the expression of a man who was surprised by the information, but the expression of a man who was measuring it against something he already knew and finding that the measurement matched. He was not a simple man. She had known that from the first day, but she was only beginning to understand how many layers that simplicity was covering. Friday came cold and gray. Clara had the midday meal time to finish exactly at 12:30, so the kitchen would be clear by the time Blake arrived. She managed it down to the minute. 22 men fed, dishes underway, the kitchen operating in the quiet, efficient rhythm she had established over the last month. Harrison Blake arrived at 2:05. She heard him before she saw him. His wagon was accompanied by a second wagon, his lawyer and 2 other men whose function was apparently to look expensive and reliable. Blake himself was the kind of man who filled a space before he finished entering it. Loud voice, large gestures, the particular confidence of someone who had spent a long time being told that his confidence was justified. She heard him greet Ben in the yard. "Benjamin, good to see you. This place is looking better than I expected, given the season." Ben's response was too quiet to hear. She kept working. She was not invited to the meeting. She had not expected to be. She was the cook, and the meeting was happening in the main sitting room of the house, which was not her domain. But the kitchen was adjacent to the sitting room, and the door was thin. She listened. Blake started with pleasantries. He was genuinely good at them. She could hear it even through the door, the warmth he put into his voice, the specific flattery aimed at a man who would be impervious to obvious flattery, and so required a more sophisticated approach. Then he moved to the proposal. He framed the eastern section exactly as Doyle had predicted: a liability. The fence trouble, the inconsistent yield, the seasonal creek that couldn't be relied on. He painted a picture of a burden, a portion of property that was costing more than it produced. "I'm not asking you to sell anything you value, Benjamin," Blake said, and his voice had the practiced sincerity of a man who had said these words before. "I'm offering to take a problem off your hands at a fair price. That's all this is." "That's a generous description," Ben said. There was a fractional pause. "It's an accurate one," Blake said smoothly. "Look at your numbers for that section over the last 2 seasons." "I've looked at them," Ben said. "Then you know what I know," Blake said. "The yield doesn't justify the maintenance cost. The water access is seasonal and unreliable. The fence is a recurring expense." He paused. "I can offer you $1,800 for the parcel. That's fair market for what it currently produces." Clara stopped moving. $1,800. For land that controlled the water source for 6 properties. She heard Ben's voice. "That's a fair market price for what it currently produces," he said. "What it currently produces isn't the same thing as what it's worth." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "I'm not sure what you mean by that distinction," Blake said. "Then let me be more specific," Ben said. There was a moment of silence. Then Ben said, "Come in, please." And the kitchen door opened. Clara looked up. She was holding a dish towel and standing next to the work table. She had known, distantly and without certainty, that this was a possibility. She had not known until this exact moment whether Ben would do it. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her steadily. "Would you bring the figures?" he said. She looked back at him for 1 full second. Then she dried her hands, picked up the folded brown paper from the shelf where she'd put it, and walked into the sitting room. Harrison Blake was a man of perhaps 50, heavy-set, well-dressed, with the kind of face that was used to getting its way. He had 2 men with him, the lawyer, thin and watchful, and a larger man, who seemed to be there mainly to be large. Blake looked at Clara when she entered. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. It was a very quick calculation. Who is this? What does she want? Why is she here? And is she a problem? He arrived at the conclusion that she was not a problem. That was his first mistake. "Mr. Blake," Ben said, "this is Clara Whitmore. She manages the household and supply operations for the ranch." Blake's expression settled into polite acknowledgement. "Ma'am." Clara placed the brown paper on the table. "The figures Mr. Carter is referring to," she said, concerned the water origination point on the eastern section. She unfolded the paper. She did not look at Blake while she did it. The creek that passes through that parcel doesn't just cross it. It originates in the upper ground of that section, which means whoever holds that land controls the primary water source for this ranch and 5 adjacent properties. She looked up. Blake's expression had changed, not dramatically. He was a man with a great deal of practice at controlling his expressions. But she had been reading faces her entire life, and she saw the exact moment when he registered that the calculation he'd made about her had been wrong. "This is a ranch cook," he said. He said it pleasantly, reasonably, with a smile that had no warmth in it at all. "Yes," Ben said from across the table. "She is." "And she's presenting figures on land valuation," Blake said. "She is," Ben said again. Blake looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at the paper on the table. "I'm also aware of the county drainage proposal," Clara said. "The one filed with the land office approximately 6 weeks ago, which would reroute the creek's lower path if the origination point came under new ownership. I pulled the reference documents from the county survey files." She reached into her apron pocket and placed 2 folded documents beside the brown paper. If the drainage proposal were approved following a sale of the eastern section, Black River Ranch would lose primary water access in 2 of its 4 grazing quadrants. The 6 adjacent properties would face similar losses. The net impact on property values in this area alone would be substantial. She paused. "I've estimated it at roughly 60% reduction in viable cattle land value for the affected ranches. I can walk through those figures if it would be helpful." The room was very quiet. Blake had stopped smiling. The lawyer had picked up the county documents and was reading them. Ben sat back in his chair and said nothing. Clara stood at the table with her hands folded in front of her and waited. It was Blake's large companion who spoke first, and what he said wasn't directed at anyone useful. He turned to Blake and said, under his breath, but not quietly enough, "How did she know about the drainage proposal?" Blake said nothing. The lawyer set the documents down. "The proposal is public record," Clara said, pleasantly, in the man's direction. "I believe it's been on file for 6 weeks." Silence. Blake sat very still for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not angry, not rattled in any obvious way, but different. Recalibrated. "You've been thorough," he said, and he directed it at Clara with the look of a man who was deciding whether he was impressed or annoyed and hadn't landed on either yet. "It's a thorough situation," she said. Blake turned to Ben. "The proposal isn't a certainty," he said. "These things take years in the county system." "They do," Ben agreed. "But the eastern section is worth considerably more than $1,800, whether the proposal goes through or not." "I could go to 8,000, Blake said. "The origination point on that creek isn't for sale," Ben said. "At any price." Blake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Benjamin, I've been doing business in this valley for 15 years. "I know," Ben said. "This isn't the way to build a relationship with your neighbors," Blake said. "I have good relationships with my neighbors," Ben said. "All 6 of the ones whose water table your drainage proposal would affect. I expect they'd be interested to see these documents." Another long silence. Blake stood up. He looked at Clara one more time. It was a different look from the first one. She'd been wrong about what he was deciding between. He wasn't trying to decide whether he was impressed or annoyed. He was trying to decide whether she was something he'd need to deal with again. She met his gaze evenly. He put on his hat. "Good afternoon," he said. He left. The lawyer followed. The large man followed the lawyer. Bun waited until he heard the wagons moving in the yard. Then he was quiet for another moment. "The county documents," he said finally. "Henry brought those back when he went for supplies." "Yes," she said. "But they weren't in the supply order I gave him," Ben said. "No," she said. "I asked him separately." "He didn't mention it to me," Ben said. "I asked him not to," she said. "Not because I was hiding anything. Because I wasn't certain what I'd find, and I didn't want to raise a concern I couldn't support." Ben looked at the papers on the table. You protected this ranch, he said. I did what I could do with the information I had, Clara said. No, Ben said. He looked up at her. You protected this ranch. Deliberately. Systematically. Over several weeks. You protected it before you even knew there was a threat. I noticed a vulnerability, she said. I try to notice vulnerabilities. That's part of how I work. You do that in kitchens too, he said. I've watched you. You identify weaknesses and you solve them before they become crises. It's the same skill, she said simply. Ben stood up from the table. He looked at her for a long moment. One of those looks she'd come to recognize, the ones that lasted a beat longer than necessary and had something moving behind them that he hadn't decided to name yet. Dinner at 6, he said. Same as every night, she said. He picked up the brown paper from the table. I'm keeping this. I made a copy, she said. Something passed through his face that was as close to surprise as she'd ever seen from him. Of course you did. He left. Clara stood alone in the sitting room. She picked up the county documents. She smoothed them flat. She thought about the look on Blake's face when he'd walked out, the reassessment, the recognition, the decision he'd been making about whether she was someone he'd need to deal with again. She thought about what it meant that Ben had opened that kitchen door and asked her in. Not because she'd asked to be included, not because any of the men had suggested it, because he'd read her figures the night before and decided on his own that she was the right person for that room. She folded the documents and put them back in her apron pocket. She went back to the kitchen and started on dinner. The meal that night was quieter than usual. Word had spread through the ranch hands with the speed that information always traveled among men who worked together closely. By the time the 6 o'clock bell rang and the men came through the door, they all knew something had happened with Blake's visit. They knew, in that incomplete passed-along way of ranch gossip, that it had not gone the way Blake planned. And they knew, though none of them said it directly at first, that Clara had something to do with it. She served the meal the same as always. She kept her face neutral, her movements efficient, her attention on the food and the timing. She didn't offer any information. It was Henry who broke first. He was too young for the patience that older men had developed. Is it true you told Blake off? He said, from his seat halfway down the table, with the barely contained excitement of someone who had heard a very good story and wanted to confirm it. No, Clara said. But you were in the meeting, he said. I provided some information, she said. Mr. Carter handled the meeting. But the information was yours, Henry pressed. Doyle said. He stopped, apparently remembering that Doyle was sitting 3 seats away and looking at him with the expression of a man who had not given permission for his name to be used. Clara looked at Doyle. Doyle looked back at her. The county documents I had you pick up, she said to Henry. Were you curious what they were for? Henry blinked. A little, he admitted. They were water survey records, she said. For the eastern section. Henry stared at her. I carried water surveys in my saddlebag for a week, and I didn't even know. You carried very important water surveys, Clara said, and I'm grateful for it. He sat back with the expression of a young man who has just learned he played a larger role in something than he realized, and was finding it both satisfying and slightly alarming. Pete, at the end of the table, said nothing. But he refilled his coffee cup himself, rather than waiting to be served, which she had come to understand was his version of a compliment. Doyle waited until most of the men had cleared out after dinner. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was washing up, and he leaned against the frame, and he said, Blake's going to be a problem going forward, isn't he? Probably, she said. We gave him reason to, Doyle said. We gave him a clear picture, she said. If that makes him a problem, the problem was already there. Doyle was quiet for a moment. He's got lawyers, he's got money, he's got political friends in the county. I know, she said. That doesn't worry you? Doyle said. She turned around and looked at him. He was not asking out of doubt. He was asking because he wanted to understand her thinking. It worries me, she said. I just don't let worry make the decisions. He studied her for a moment. You know, he said slowly, when you first walked through that door, I thought... He stopped. I know what you thought, she said. I was wrong, he said. I know that too, she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. Clara went back to the dishes. She was almost finished when she heard a knock at the kitchen door. The exterior one, not the interior door that led to the house. She dried her hands and opened it. Bun was standing on the step. He had his hat in his hand. That was unusual. She had never seen him knock on her kitchen door. I wanted to say something, he said. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he sometimes was when he'd decided what he wanted to say, but was choosing the exact words. I should have brought you into more of the ranch conversations earlier, he said. Not just the supply management, the bigger ones. She looked at him. I'm the cook, she said carefully. You're the person on this property who most clearly understands how all the pieces fit together, he said. That's not a cook. That's not any single role I've got a word for. I do the job I was hired for, she said. I just happen to pay attention to more than the job requires. That's what I mean, he said. Most people pay attention to what's immediately in front of them. You pay attention to how things connect. So do you, she said, because it was true, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. It was open, in a way his face usually wasn't, as if something had dropped that he normally kept carefully in place. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, she said. When you took this job, he said, what were you actually hoping for? Not the wages, not the practical answer. What were you hoping for? She stood in the doorway for a long moment. She thought about the job board in Millhaven. She thought about the hotel and the boarding house and the dress shop and the particular quality of humiliation that came from being seen and then immediately dismissed. She thought about what she'd said to herself when she'd pulled that advertisement down from the board and put it in her pocket. I was hoping for a place where what I could do mattered more than what I looked like doing it, she said. The silence that followed was long and not uncomfortable. Did you find it? He said. She looked at him. I'm starting to think so, she said. He put his hat back on. Good, he said. And he walked back into the dark toward the bunkhouse, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. But she stood there a moment longer than necessary, and the Montana night was cold and very clear and full of stars, and inside her chest something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way things shifted in stories, quietly, the way real things changed. She closed the door and finished the dishes, and the ranch settled into its nighttime silence around her. And she thought about Harrison Blake's face when he'd walked out of that sitting room, and Ben's face when he'd opened the kitchen door, and Doyle's face when he'd said I was wrong. And she thought that perhaps the most extraordinary thing that had happened to her in the last month was not any single event. It was the accumulation, the daily, incremental, almost unremarkable accumulation of being seen. She blew out the kitchen. She had 22 men to feed in the morning. She had work to do. She went to bed. She found the letter on a Monday. It was sitting on the kitchen work table when she came down before dawn to start the breakfast fire. A plain white envelope with no name on the outside, just placed there, deliberately, where she would find it first thing. She stood in the dark kitchen with the envelope in her hand for a moment before she lit the lamp. Then she opened it. The handwriting was clean and precise, the kind that came from a man who had paid for a proper education. The letter was short. It said, Miss Whitmore, your involvement in private ranch business matters is noted. Future interference will have consequences that extend beyond your current employment. This is a professional courtesy. H. Blake. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in her apron pocket. She lit the stove. She started the coffee. She began measuring flour for biscuits, because 22 men needed to eat at 6 o'clock, and a threatening letter from Harrison Blake was not going to change that fact. But her hands were not entirely steady for the first 5 minutes. She noticed that. She allowed herself to notice it. There was a difference between feeling afraid and letting fear make decisions, and she had learned that distinction over years of practice. Fear was information. It told you the situation was serious. What you did with the information was the part that mattered. She thought about who had delivered the letter. It had been placed inside the kitchen, which meant someone with access to the house. That narrowed it considerably. She thought about the men on the ranch, one by one, with the methodical care she applied to any problem, and she arrived at two possibilities. And then she set that question aside, because she didn't have enough information yet, and speculation without evidence was not something she invested in. She thought about whether to tell Ben. She thought about it for the length of time it took to measure out the flour and the lard and the salt, and by the time she was cutting the biscuit dough, she had decided, yes, she would tell him. Not because she was frightened and needed help. She was frightened, but that wasn't the reason. She would tell him because it was information about his ranch, and withholding information about his ranch from him, on the grounds that she could manage it herself, would be the same error that Blake made when he underestimated what she knew. She was not going to be the kind of person who hid things because she wanted to appear capable of handling them alone. She told him at 6:30, after the men had been served and were eating, and she could slip out of the kitchen for 3 minutes. She found him in the yard and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His face didn't move the way most faces moved when reading something alarming. He was very still. But she watched his jaw and the line of his shoulders, and she could read the stillness well enough by now to know it wasn't the stillness of someone who was unaffected. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Kitchen table," she said. "Before dawn." "Someone put it inside the house." "Yes." He folded the letter. "I'm going to ask you something and I need an honest answer," he said. "All right," she said. "Are you afraid?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes." He nodded once, like that was the right answer. "Good," he said. "People who aren't afraid of Blake don't take him seriously enough. He's not a man who makes threats he's not prepared to act on." "I figured that," she said. "Do you want to step back from the ranch business matters?" he said. "The supply stuff, you keep that, but the other things, the conversations, the documents, if you want to pull back, I understand. It's not what you were hired for." Or she looked at him. "I don't want to pull back," she said. Something in his expression shifted. "Clara, he put that letter in my kitchen," she said. "My kitchen. I was up before 4 this morning and I had it in my hand before I had my coffee. If he thought that was going to make me smaller, he doesn't understand how I work." Ben was quiet for the moment. Then he said, "All right." Just that. "But you're not doing this alone," he said. "Whatever comes next, you're not handling it alone. That's not negotiable." "I don't want to do it alone," she said. "I never wanted to do it alone. I just needed to know you were still in the room." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one that lasted longer than it needed to, and had something behind it she couldn't name precisely. "I'm in the room," he said. She went back to the kitchen. The men who had access to the house before dawn were a shorter list than she'd hoped. By midday, she had narrowed it to 3 realistic candidates and one she could almost certainly rule out. She sat with this information quietly and watched the lunch service and observed the men with the particular attention she'd developed over a lifetime of needing to read rooms accurately. It was Pete who told her, at the end of the afternoon, in his characteristic economy of words. He appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was prepping the evening meal and said, without greeting, "Younger Hutchins boy." She turned around. "Excuse me?" "Letter," Pete said. "You're wondering who put it there. Younger Hutchins' brother. Came on 2 weeks ago. Blake's brother-in-law's stepson. Nobody thought to mention that because nobody thought it was relevant." She stared at him. "How do you know about the letter?" Pete looked at her with the expression of a man who was mildly insulted. "I'm old," he said. "I watch things." "Does Ben know?" she said. "Told him an hour ago," Pete said. She was quiet for a moment. "The Hutchins boy. Is he dangerous?" "Stupid, mostly," Pete said. "Blake uses people like that. Deniable. If something goes wrong, it was just a foolish kid who made a mistake." "And what happens to the kid?" she said. Pete looked at her. It was a long look. "You're asking about him. He's young," she said. He probably didn't understand what he was carrying. He understood enough, Pete said, but not all of it. He paused. Ben sent him home this afternoon, paid him out and told him the work wasn't a fit. No accusations. Clara absorbed this. That was the right call, she said. Usually is with Ben, Pete said. He left. Clara stood at the work table for a moment, absorbing the shape of what had just shifted. Blake had placed someone inside the ranch. The ranch had found him and removed him cleanly, without confrontation, without the kind of noise that would give Blake something to respond to. That was not an accident. That was Ben. She thought about what it meant that Ben operated this way, quietly, precisely, without the need to be seen handling things. She thought about how long he'd been doing that and how good he was at it. She thought about how well they worked in parallel. The thought came and went quickly. She turned back to the stove. The following week brought a new problem, and it arrived in a different form entirely. A wagon came out from Mill Haven on a Wednesday, carrying 3 women, the wives of 2 neighboring ranchers, and a woman who was apparently associated with the county administrative office in some capacity that Clara never quite clarified. They had come, ostensibly, to call on Ben. They had brought food. They were warm, polished, and completely unapologetic about inspecting Clara from the moment they set foot inside the door. She was not imagining it. She had spent her whole life being inspected by women who were deciding whether she was a threat, an amusement, or simply not worth their attention. These 3 did it with the practiced subtlety of women who had learned to do it without appearing to. She served them coffee and let them do it. She kept her face open and her manner courteous. She asked their names and used them correctly and answered the questions they asked her without offering anything they hadn't asked for. Bon was in the sitting room with them, and Clara could hear the conversation through the door, pleasant, careful, full of the particular kind of social navigation that went on between people who were neighbors, but also rivals, in the diffuse, unacknowledged way that everyone who shared a valley was always in some competition for standing. The woman from the county office, her name was Mrs. Alderton, managed to engineer a reason to come into the kitchen near the end of the visit. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had once been very pretty and was now very shrewd. "How are you finding it out here?" she asked, with a warmth that was entirely real and slightly calculated at the same time. "Suits me well," Clara said. "It must be quite a change from town," Mrs. Alderton said, letting her eyes move briefly around the kitchen in a way that was meant to seem casual. "You're from Mill Haven originally?" "I passed through Mill Haven," Clara said. "I'm from Wyoming originally." "Long way from home," Mrs. Alderton said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Mr. Carter is very well regarded in this county," Mrs. Alderton said. The shift in subject was smooth. "He's been good for the valley, kept to himself more than some people would prefer, perhaps." She looked at Clara with a directness that dropped the pleasantries. "People have been curious about the goings-on out here since he hired a woman for more than a domestic position." Clara looked at her. "I'm the cook," she said. "You sat in on a business meeting with Harrison Blake," Mrs. Alderton said. "That's not typically cook's business." "Mr. Carter invited me in," Clara said. "I provided information relevant to the meeting. I went back to the kitchen afterward." Mrs. Alderton studied her for a moment. "Blake is telling a different version of events around town." "I expect he is," Clara said. "He's saying a ranch hand put county documents in front of him to manufacture a threat that doesn't exist," Mrs. Alderton said. "He's saying the drainage proposal was misrepresented." Clara kept her expression level. "The proposal is public record," she said. "I pulled the filed documents directly. Anyone can verify them." "I know," Mrs. Alderton said, and her voice changed. The calculation dropped out of it, and something more direct came through. "I'm the one who files those documents. I know exactly what's in them and exactly what Blake was planning." She paused. "I came out here today because I wanted to see who you were." Clara was quiet. "And?" she said. Mrs. Alderton looked at her for a long moment. "The other ranchers whose water would have been affected. They don't know yet what was almost decided about their land. Someone should probably tell them." Clara met her eyes. "Someone probably should," she agreed. Mrs. Alderton nodded, once, crisply. Good afternoon, Miss Whitmore. Good afternoon, Mrs. Alderton. She left. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after the sound of the wagon faded from the yard. She thought about what it meant that Mrs. Alderton had come specifically to see her. She thought about what it meant that the woman had effectively just told her that there were people in the county who knew what Blake was doing and needed the information to reach the right people without Blake being able to claim a campaign against him. She thought about how wide the problem was and how it extended far beyond Black River Ranch. She went to find Ben. She found him in the yard, watching the women's wagon disappear down the track. Mrs. Alderton, she said. Do you know her well? Well enough, he said. She's been in the county office for 12 years. She knows where every document in the county is filed and who filed it and why. She told me the neighboring ranchers don't know what Blake was planning, Clara said. Ben looked at her. I know. Are you going to tell them? She said. I was thinking about how, he said. She implied that if the information came through a channel that wasn't you directly, it would be harder for Blake to frame it as a personal dispute, Clara said. He's already telling people the Blake meeting was a manufactured conflict. Ben was very still. She said that to you. In her own way, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. You understand what you're describing, he said. If the neighboring ranchers get organized around this, it becomes a valley-wide problem. Blake has friends in the county. It won't stay quiet. I know, she said. Do you want it to stay quiet? He didn't answer immediately. He looked out in the direction the wagon had gone and was quiet for a long time. No, he said. I don't. Then I think we have work to do, she said. He looked at her, and something happened in that look. Something that had been building slowly for weeks, an accumulation of glances and conversations and parallel silences. And it arrived now at a point that was different from all the previous points, more charged, more direct. A look that was not about the ranch or Blake or the water rights or any of the practical business that had been the scaffolding of all their interactions. It lasted only a moment. Then Ben looked away, and the moment passed, and they were back to practical ground. I'll ride out to the Saunders place tomorrow morning, he said. They're the closest, and they've got the most at stake after us. I'll put together a summary document tonight, she said. The figures on water table impact. They can verify it themselves. All right, he said. She went back inside. She worked until well past 10 that night, long after the house had gone quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the brown paper in front of her, building the clearest possible picture of what Blake had been planning and what it would cost the valley if it succeeded. She was nearly finished when she heard a board creak in the hallway and looked up. Bun was standing into the kitchen doorway in a plain shirt and trousers, clearly not having been to sleep. He had a look on his face that she couldn't immediately read. You should rest, he said. I'm almost done, she said. He came in and sat down at the other end of the table. He didn't offer to help. He didn't look at the papers. He just sat, quietly, in the lamplight, in the same way he occupied every space, as if his being there was a simple fact that required no explanation. She kept working. After a few minutes, he said, You were from Wyoming. Near Laramie, she said, without looking up. Family there? He said. My mother, she said. She died when I was 20. My father was gone before I could remember him. No one else? He said. No one else, she said. A pause. I've been in Montana since I was 19, he said. Came with nothing. She looked up at that. I was looking at the table, not at her. My family had land in Missouri that went to my older brother, standard practice. I was the second son, so I came west with what I could carry and figured out the rest. Black River wasn't inherited, she said. No, he said. It was built. That explains some things, she said. He looked up. Like what? The way you watch the men, she said. The way you're careful about what you take credit for. You know what it costs to build something from nothing. You respect it when you see it. He looked at her steadily. You built something in that kitchen, he said. In 6 weeks. I was given the materials, she said. Plenty of people have materials, he said. Not many people build what you've built. She held his gaze for a moment, and then looked back down at her paper, because the look was becoming one of the longer ones again, and she didn't entirely trust what she might say if she let it continue. I'm almost finished, she said. Take your time, he said. He stayed until she was done. He walked her to the foot of the stairs, said goodnight in his plain, economical way, and went to his own room. She went to hers and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came, thinking about what it meant that he'd sat with her in the lamplight for an hour and a half, saying almost nothing, and it had felt like the most companionable hour and a half she could remember. The next morning, he rode out to the Saunders ranch with the summary document in his coat. He came back in the late afternoon with a look on his face she recognized, the look of someone who had confirmed something they'd suspected. He appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was starting dinner. Saunders didn't know about the drainage proposal, he said. He knew Blake had been buying up land, but he didn't know why. He's calling a meeting of the affected ranchers for Saturday. Good, she said. He wants you there, Ben said. She turned around. Me. I wants the person who pulled the county documents, Ben said. I told him it was you. He said to bring you. Clara stood very still for a moment. I've never been to a meeting of that kind, she said. I know, Ben said. I'm a woman, she said, and I'm your cook. You're the person who best understands what we're dealing with, Ben said. Come if you want to. Don't come if you don't want to. But Saunders asked, and I think he's right to. She thought about it. All right, she said. Saturday came with the particular weight of days when things are decided. There were 7 ranchers in the Saunders sitting room, including Ben. Clara was the only woman. She was aware of this, and she was aware of being looked at, and she was aware of the particular quality of the silence when she was introduced. Not hostility exactly, but a recalibration that happened in the room when men who had been expecting one thing encountered a different thing than they expected. She had been through this before. She let it happen. She sat to the side rather than at the main table. She brought the documents. She waited. The meeting went for an hour before her involvement became necessary. By then, the men had established the baseline of the problem. They all confirmed that Blake had been approaching them individually with various proposals over the last 2 seasons, that the proposals had different surface appearances, but a consistent underlying goal. That nobody had understood the water rights dimension until Black River Ranch had surfaced the county documents. Then, one of the ranchers, a man named Prentice, who had the impatient energy of someone who wanted conclusions, said, I want to see the figures on water table impact, the actual numbers. Ben looked at Clara. She moved to the table. She laid out the documents. She explained the water origination point. She walked through the drainage proposal and its effect on each of the 7 properties represented in the room. She answered 4 questions, one of them hostile, from a man named Cutter, who didn't like being shown things by a woman and didn't entirely hide it. And she answered the hostile question the same way she answered the others, directly, with the numbers in front of him, without apology. Cutter was quiet after that. Prentice said, How confident are you in these figures? They're based on county survey data filed with the land office, Clara said. The projections use a conservative estimate. The actual impact could be higher. Conservative estimate, Prentice repeated. I'd rather give you numbers I can defend than numbers that look more alarming, she said. These are defensible. Saunders, who had said very little, looked around the table. Anyone here want to argue with the math? No one did. The meeting went another 40 minutes. By the end, the 7 ranchers had agreed to jointly retain a lawyer to review the drainage proposal and file a formal objection with the county land office, and to share the cost of doing so. Walking back out to the horses afterward, Prentice came alongside Clara and said, without preamble, Where'd you learn to do that? 12 years of paying attention to things, she said. He looked at her sideways. You're wasted as a cook. I'm a very good cook, she said. He almost smiled. I believe it. They rode back to Black River Ranch in the late afternoon, Ben and Clara side by side on the road, the land opening up around them in the particular way of Montana in late summer. They didn't speak for the first mile. Then Ben said, Cutter was wrong to speak to you that way. He was, she agreed. I should have said something in the room, he said. She looked at him. You didn't need to. I handled it. I know you handled it, he said. That's not the point. She was quiet for a moment. You would have undercut me if you'd stepped in, she said. The room needed to see me handle it. If you'd defended me, the response they remembered would have been yours, not mine. He rode in silence for a moment. You thought all of that in the moment, he said. It wasn't much to think, she said. It's just how those situations work. It's not obvious to most people how those situations work, he said. It is if you've been in enough of them, she said. He was quiet for a beat. How many of them have you been in? He said. She looked at the road ahead. More than I should have had to be, she said. But they taught me something, so I don't waste the time being angry about it. He didn't say anything to that, but she felt him, beside her, absorbing it. The way he absorbed everything she said, without commentary, without the need to fix it or reframe it, just taking it in and holding it. They were perhaps a mile from the ranch when he said carefully, You've been on this ranch 7 weeks. 49 days, she said. He glanced at her. You're counting. I count things, she said. I've always counted things. What does 49 days feel like? He said. She thought about it honestly. Like I've been here much longer, she said. And also like I arrived yesterday, both at the same time. That's how it feels when a place starts to matter, he said. She kept her eyes on the road. Yes, she said quietly. I think that's right. They came over the last rise and the ranch spread out below them in the evening light. The main house, the outbuildings, the cattle pens, the fencing stretching out toward the eastern section where the creek ran. And something hit Clara in the chest that she hadn't been expecting. It looked like home. Not just a place she was working. Not just a position she'd secured. It looked like something that had become part of her in 7 weeks without her giving permission for it to happen. She felt it and said nothing about it. They rode down to the yard. Garrett was there and took the horses. Henry appeared from somewhere and said something to Ben that required a brief answer. Clara dismounted and straightened her coat and was about to go inside when Ben said from behind her, Clara. She turned. Howe was still standing by the horses, and he had an expression on his face that was different from his usual range of expressions. Not closed, not measured. More open than she'd seen him, and more uncertain, and it made him look, for a moment, younger than he usually did. I'm glad you stayed, he said. On the ranch. I'm glad you didn't leave. She looked at him. I didn't have anywhere to leave to, she said, because it was true, and because she wasn't quite able yet to say the other thing, the real thing, which was that she wouldn't have left even if she had. You could have left, he said. After Blake's letter, after the meeting pressure, a lot of people would have. I'm not a lot of people, she said. No, he said. You're not. The look between them lasted longer than it should have, and then Henry said something from across the yard and broke it, and Ben turned, and the moment dissolved. Clara went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the early evening quiet, with the smell of the stove and the familiar weight of the space around her, and she put her hand flat on the work table and stood there. She thought about what Ben had said. I'm glad you stayed. She thought about the ranch sitting room, where she had spread her figures in front of 7 ranchers who hadn't expected her. She thought about Blake's letter in her apron pocket, and what it had cost her to go downstairs and light that stove anyway. She thought about 49 days and what they had built. She started dinner. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling toward evening, the men coming in, the cattle moving, the particular rhythm of Black River Ranch doing what it had always done, living, working, enduring. She fed 22 men. She cleaned the kitchen. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a long time, because something was coming. She could feel it the way she felt problems before they fully arrived, not in words, not in specific images, but as a pressure, a change in the air of things. Blake had not given up. A man like that didn't lose one meeting and retire. He was recalculating. He was planning something larger than a letter and a planted ranch hand, and whatever it was It was coming toward Black River Ranch with the particular inevitability of a storm you can see on the horizon long before you can feel the wind. She lay in the dark and thought about Ben's face when he'd said, "I'm glad you stayed." She thought about what she hadn't said back, and she thought that whatever was coming, whatever Blake was building in the dark outside the edges of this valley, she was not going to face it from a position of having left anything unsaid that mattered. Not this time. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow, there would be work. There was always work. But something else was building too, something quieter than the storm on the horizon, something that had nothing to do with water rights or county documents or Harrison Blake's lawyers, something that had to do with a man who counted the days differently than she did, and a kitchen that looked like home, and 49 days that had changed her in ways she hadn't given permission for. She slept. The storm she had felt coming arrived on a Tuesday, and it did not come from the direction she expected. She was in the kitchen at 7:30 in the morning, 3 days after the Saunders meeting, when she heard the wagon coming fast down the track. Too fast for a delivery, too deliberate for a casual visit. She heard it before any of the men mentioned it, and she had already moved to the window when Doyle came through the kitchen door with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that she had not seen before. "We've got trouble," he said. "What kind?" she said. "Blake's filed a claim with the county land office," he said, "on the eastern section." She went very still. "He can't file a claim on land he doesn't own." "He's not claiming ownership," Doyle said. "He's claiming a water rights dispute. Says Black River Ranch has been illegally restricting access to the creek for 2 seasons. Says he's got documentation." "What documentation?" she said. "That's what we don't know," Doyle said. The wagon had stopped in the yard. She could hear voices. She took off her apron and walked through the house to the front. Ben was standing in the yard with 2 men she didn't recognize. One was in a county official's coat, the kind that meant government business, not a social call. The other was Blake's lawyer, the thin, watchful man from the first meeting. He was holding a document that he extended toward Ben with the practiced manner of someone who had done this many times. Ben took it. He read it. His face didn't change. Then he looked up and his eyes found Clara, standing in the doorway, and he said, "Come here." She walked out. He handed her the document without explanation. She read it. The claim was detailed and professionally constructed. It alleged that Black River Ranch had, over the course of 2 grazing seasons, diverted creek water through artificial means to restrict downstream flow to adjacent properties, thereby violating established water rights in the county. It named Harrison Blake as the principal complainant and listed 2 other property holders as co-complainants, names she didn't recognize. At the bottom of the document was a date for a county hearing, 3 weeks away. "This is fabricated," she said. "Miss," the county official said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told to deliver the document and nothing more, "that's for the hearing to determine." "The creek runs naturally through the eastern section," she said. "There's no artificial diversion. The county survey records would show any change in the water course." "Miss," the official started, "is there a water course alteration in the survey records?" she said directly. He paused. "I'm not in a position to—" "Yes or no," she said. "Has a change in the creek's course been recorded in the county land office survey records for this property in the last 2 seasons?" A silence. "No," the official said. "Then the basis of the claim is not supported by the county's own records," she said. "Which means this hearing will require Blake to produce independent evidence of a diversion that doesn't appear in official surveys. I'd be very interested to see that evidence." Blake's lawyer had been watching her throughout this exchange with an expression that was no longer the dismissive one he'd worn at the first meeting. He said smoothly, "The survey records don't capture all physical alterations. Field evidence will be presented at the hearing." "I look forward to seeing it," Clara said. She handed the document back to Ben. Ben looked at the 2 men. "We'll be at the hearing," he said simply. The county official looked relieved. The lawyer looked like he was recalculating something. They left. Ben stood in the yard with the document in his hand. The ranch had gone quiet around them. She could feel the men listening from various distances, trying not to appear to. He manufactured evidence, Ben said quietly. Or he's planning to, she said. We don't know yet which. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks is enough time, she said. He looked at her. For what? To build the counter-argument, she said. The creek's natural course has been consistent. There's the supply driver's 7 years of observation. There's the county survey data. And there's something else. What? He said. The 2 co-complainants, she said. The names at the bottom of that document. I don't know those ranches. But I'd bet what I own, which isn't much, that Blake approached them the same way he approached you, and they said no, and this complaint is partly how he's punishing them for it, while making his claim look broader than it is. Ben was looking at her with the full weight of his attention. You got all that from reading it once, he said. I read fast, she said. He almost smiled. Then the almost smile faded, and he was back to the gravity of the situation, because this was serious, and they both knew it. A formal county hearing was not a meeting in a sitting room. It was official. It had consequences. I need to send word to Saunders and the others, he said. They need to know this is moving faster than we thought. I'll prepare updated figures, she said, including those 2 co-complainant properties. If we can show the hearing officer that Blake approached all of them before filing this complaint, the pattern speaks for itself. How are you going to find out if he approached them? Ben said. I'm going to write them letters, she said. Today. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, he said. I know, she said. It's not my fight. That's not what I was going to say, he said. She waited. I was going to say thank you, he said, for not making me ask. She held his gaze for a moment. Go send your word to Saunders, she said. I'll have letters drafted by noon. She went back inside. The next 2 weeks were the hardest she'd spent at Black River Ranch, and they were hard in a different way from the early weeks. Not the physical difficulty of establishing herself in an unfamiliar kitchen, but the sustained mental effort of building a legal defense for a man who had done nothing wrong, and was being challenged by someone who had the money and connections to manufacture the appearance of wrongdoing convincingly. She wrote 4 letters that first day. 2 went to the co-complainant ranchers. 1 went to Mrs. Alderton at the county office. 1 went to a lawyer in Mill Haven, whose name Ben had mentioned in passing as someone with county hearing experience. All 4 wrote back within 5 days. Both co-complainant ranchers, men named Ferris and Alcott, as it turned out, had indeed been approached by Blake, had declined his proposals, and were furious to find their names on his complaint. Ferris wrote back in language that was unprintable in a formal context, but extremely clear in its intent. Alcott was more measured, but no less certain. He had not authorized the use of his name, and wanted to know what he could do about it. She brought the letters to Ben the afternoon they arrived. He read Ferris's letter and raised an eyebrow. He's colorful, she said. That's one word, Ben said. He read Alcott's. Then he set both down and looked at her. Blake put their names on a complaint they didn't agree to. That's what it looks like, she said. That's not a legal gray area, he said. That's fraud. It is, she said. And if Ferris and Alcott testify to that at the hearing, the entire complaint structure collapses. Ben was very quiet for a moment. He overreached, he said. He's used to overreaching working, she said. It usually works because people don't compare notes. Nobody was comparing notes until now. Ben looked at her. Because of you, he said. Because of this meeting Saunders called, she said. Which happened because of you, he said. She didn't argue. It was true, and arguing with true things was a waste of time. What does the lawyer say? Ben asked. He's reviewed the complaint and the county survey data, she said. He says Blake's field evidence claim is weak. There's no independent survey that shows an artificial diversion, and without that, the complaint relies entirely on witness testimony, which means it relies on Blake's witnesses. Who are presumably paid, Ben said. Or pressured, she said. Which is another thing the hearing officer might find interesting, if it's documented. He looked at her steadily. You've thought about this from every angle. I think about problems from every angle, she said. It's how I work. I know, he said. I've been watching you do it for 2 months. 2 months. She hadn't counted the exact number of days recently. She'd been too busy. But she looked at him and did the math and realized he was right. It had been just over 2 months. She didn't say anything about that. She said, "The lawyer wants to meet with you before the hearing. I can prepare a summary document for him to work from." "Do it," Ben said. She stood to go. "Clara," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her with that expression again. The open one. The one that sat outside his usual careful range. But there was something else in it now. Something that had been building and was closer to the surface than it had been before. "When this is over," he said, "when the hearing's done and Blake's sorted, I want to have a different kind of conversation with you." She looked at him. "What kind?" she said carefully. "Not about water rights," he said. The silence between them was charged and specific, and not entirely comfortable in the way that silences could be not uncomfortable. It was the discomfort of something real and large being acknowledged for the first time. "All right," she said quietly. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table with her hands flat on the surface and thought about what he'd said. Not about water rights. She knew what that meant. She had known for some time, in the peripheral, careful way she knew things, she wasn't ready to look at directly. She had been managing the knowledge, filing it away, keeping it quiet, not letting it affect the work, because the work was what mattered, and she was not the kind of woman who let herself be distracted from what mattered by what she wanted. But he had named it now. Not explicitly, but named it enough. She took a breath. She started working. The lawyer arrived on a Friday, a compact, efficient man named Greer, who had the focused energy of someone who had practiced law in the West long enough to understand that Western legal disputes were frequently more about land and water than they were about law, and that the facts needed to be built into an argument that a county hearing officer could follow without getting lost in the complexity. He spent 3 hours with Ben. He spent 1 hour with Clara. That 1 hour was the most densely factual conversation she'd had in months. Greer asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and at the end of it, he looked at her across the kitchen table and said, in the tone of a man revising an assessment, "How much of this case did you build?" "I provided the background research," she said. "Mr. Carter will present." "Mr. Carter told me you pulled the county documents, identified the water origination point, connected Blake's drainage proposal to the complaint structure, and identified the co-complainant fraud," Greer said. "That's not background research, that's the case." "It's what I observed," she said. "Presenting it in a legal context is different work." "It is," he agreed. "But the foundation is yours." He paused. "The hearing officer is going to ask who identified the drainage proposal connection. I'd like your permission to name you." Clara was quiet for a moment. "If it helps the case," she said. "It might," he said. "You're not a party to the dispute, which means your identification of the documents is less easily characterized as self-interested." "All right," she said. "You can name me." Greer nodded, made a note, and closed his file. He stood. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been practicing law for 23 years in this territory. I've met a handful of people in that time who could build an argument the way you've built this one. You're aware that you're wasting your considerable abilities in a kitchen." She looked at him. "You're the second person to tell me that in 3 weeks," she said. "You should consider what it means that two people said it independently," he said. "I consider a lot of things," she said. "Good day, Mr. Greer." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. She thought about what it meant. She thought about the kitchen, and the 22 men, and the supply ledgers, and the supply driver, and Pete's 7 years of observation, and the brown paper figures on the table, and the county documents in her apron pocket, and the letter from Blake, and the letters from Ferris and Alcott, and the hearing that was 12 days away. She thought about Ben saying not about water rights. She thought about 2 months of building something she hadn't expected to be allowed to build. She went back to work. The night before the hearing, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. It was late, past 10, the house quiet, the kitchen dark, except for the lamp she was using to review her final summary document one more time, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the bunkhouse. She almost stayed where she was. Raised voices among ranch hands in the evening were not unprecedented and were generally not her business. Then she heard her name. She got up. The voices were coming from just outside the bunkhouse door. When she got close enough to hear clearly, she stopped. It was Doyle's voice, and it was harder than she'd heard it before. Not the loud, confident Doyle of the first weeks, but the flattened, quieter voice of a man who was genuinely angry and keeping it contained. "You don't speak about her that way," Doyle was saying. "Not on this ranch. Not anywhere I can hear you." The response was from a voice she didn't recognize, low and slightly slurred, which suggested the man had been drinking. "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking," the voice said. "She's got Carter wrapped around her finger, running the ranch like she owns it. It ain't natural." "What ain't natural," Doyle said, with a precision that was more dangerous than volume, "is a man with less brains than a fence post running his mouth about a woman who's done more for this ranch in 2 months than you've done in a year and a half." "She's a cook," the voice said. "She's the reason this ranch still has its water rights," Doyle said flatly. "She's the reason Blake's going in front of a hearing officer tomorrow instead of sitting in the county office signing documents. And if you can't see that, the problem is your eyes, not her." Silence. "And if I hear you say her name like that again," Doyle said, "you and I are going to have a different conversation than this one." More silence. Then boots on the ground, moving away. Clara stood in the dark outside the bunkhouse for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen. She sat down at the table and looked at the summary document in front of her, and did not immediately pick up the pen. She thought about Doyle in the first week. The deliberate look, the joke at her expense, the laugh he'd pulled from the men at her cost. She thought about Doyle now. People could change. She believed that. She had always believed it, even when she hadn't wanted to, even when the evidence seemed weighted against it. She believed it because she had watched it happen, slowly and without announcement, in the man who'd first made her the punchline of a dinner table joke. She picked up the pen. She finished the document. The county hearing was held in the Millhaven Courthouse, which was a plain building with hard wooden benches and a hearing officer named Dunmore, who had the air of a man who had seen many disputes over land and water and was not going to be impressed by either party until the facts made impressing him unavoidable. Blake was there with his lawyer and 2 witnesses Clara didn't recognize. He looked at her when she came in with Ben and Greer, and his expression was controlled, but she could read what was behind it. The surprise, the recalculation, the specific irritation of a man who had expected to be in a room with Ben Carter and a lawyer, and had instead found Ben Carter, a lawyer, and the woman who had been in his way since the beginning. Ferris and Alcott were there. Ferris was a large, red-faced man who looked like he'd been looking forward to this for 2 weeks. Alcott was quieter, but no less determined. Mrs. Alderton was there. She sat at the side and said nothing. She was there to observe, which Clara suspected meant she was there to make sure the records were correct. The hearing began. Blake's lawyer presented the complaint. It was polished and thorough, and built around the testimony of 2 witnesses who claimed to have observed artificial modifications to the creek course on Black River Ranch land. The first witness described a specific location and a specific alteration. The second corroborated the first. Greer did not object during the testimony. He took notes. He was very still. When it was their turn, he stood. "Hearing Officer Dunmore," he said, "I'd like to begin by addressing the co-complainants listed on Mr. Blake's filing." Dunmore looked at the document in front of him. "Ferris and Alcott." "Yes," Greer said. "Both Mr. Ferris and Mr. Alcott are present today. I'd ask that the record note that both men have provided sworn statements that they did not authorize the use of their names on this complaint and were not consulted before filing." Dunmore looked at Ferris. Ferris said, "That's correct. I found out my name was on it from a letter." Dunmore looked at Alcott. Alcott said, "Same. I didn't sign anything. I didn't agree to anything. My name was put on that document without my knowledge." Dunmore looked at Blake's lawyer with an expression that had shifted into something cooler. The lawyer began a response. Dunmore cut him off. "Noted," he said. He made a mark in his papers. "Continue." Greer continued. He walked through the county survey records. He presented the water origination point documentation. He explained the drainage proposal and its relationship to the complaint. Not directly, but clearly enough that the implication was impossible to miss. Then he said, "The survey records covering the eastern section of Black River Ranch show no alteration to the natural watercourse in the last 4 years. Mr. Blake's witnesses have described an alteration at a specific location. I would ask the hearing officer to note the coordinates of that location and compare them to the survey boundary maps." He placed the maps in front of Dunmore. Dunmore looked at them. He looked for a long time. Then he looked up. "The location described by the witnesses," he said carefully, "is not on Black River Ranch land." The room went very quiet. "It's on the Saunders property," Dunmore said, "adjacent to Black River Ranch, but not part of it." Blake's lawyer was on his feet. "The witness descriptions are geographically inaccurate," Dunmore said, with the patience of a man who was running out of it. "Whether through error or other means, the location testified to does not correspond to the property named in the complaint." Clara sat very still. She had found this. She had found this 3 days ago when she was reviewing the final figures, and something about the witness description in the complaint document hadn't matched the survey coordinates. She had almost dismissed it as her own error. She had checked it twice. She had brought it to Greer at 11 o'clock at night, and he had verified it himself, and then looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she would not forget. She had not told Ben. She had told Greer, and Greer had decided how to use it, and Ben had trusted them both. Ben was sitting next to her. She felt him go still in the particular way he went still when something significant had just landed. He turned his head and looked at her. She met his eyes. He knew. He knew she'd found it. She looked back at Dunmore. Blake's lawyer was speaking. Dunmore was listening with the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was waiting for the speaking to stop. It stopped. Dunmore said, "This complaint is dismissed. The water rights of Black River Ranch are affirmed. Given the discrepancy between the testimony and the actual survey boundaries, and the unauthorized use of co-complainant names, I'm referring this matter to the county attorney's office for review of the filing." He closed his papers. "This hearing is concluded," he said. The room moved. Blake stood. He looked, for the first time in Clara's experience of him, like a man who had lost. Not just this particular engagement, but something larger. The expression of a man who has spent years not losing and has encountered the specific experience of losing in a way he cannot immediately reframe. He looked at Clara before he left. She met his gaze. He left. Outside on the steps of the courthouse, the autumn air hit them, cool, with the particular clarity of Montana at the turn of the season. Ferris shook Ben's hand vigorously and said several things that were largely not printable. Alcott was more contained, but equally firm. Saunders clapped Ben on the shoulder and said, "Hell of a day." Greer spoke quietly to Ben about the county attorney referral and what it might mean going forward. Clara stood slightly apart from it, listening to all of it, feeling the particular sensation of a problem resolved. Not triumphant exactly, because she didn't experience victories that way. More like release. The long tension of a sustained effort finally loosened. Henry appeared at her elbow. He had come with the group from the ranch and had been sitting in the back benches throughout. He said, with the earnest relief of someone who has been holding his breath for 2 hours, "Is it done?" "It's done," she said. He exhaled. "I didn't understand all of it," he said. "But I understood enough. Blake's finished in this valley, isn't he?" "He's significantly diminished," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it's close." Henry nodded. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, with the specific admiration of a young person who has found someone they want to learn from. "How'd you know about the coordinates?" he said. "I heard Greer say you found that." "I check everything twice," she said. "And then I check it again." He grinned. "I'm going to do that," he said. "Check everything 3 times." "Good," she said. Bun appeared at her side as the group began to move toward the wagons. He said nothing immediately. He walked with her. In the particular way he had of being beside someone. Not crowding, not distant. Just present in a way that felt deliberately chosen. When they were slightly ahead of the others, he said quietly, The coordinates. 3 days ago, she said. I almost missed it. But you didn't, he said. No, she said. You didn't tell me, he said. Not accusatory, observing. I didn't want to raise it if I was wrong, she said. And by the time I knew I was right, Greer had the presentation structure built. Adding it at the last moment would have disrupted his timing. You let him use it without telling me, he said. I told him, she said. I trusted him to use it correctly. Ben was quiet for a moment. You trusted him, and you trusted me to trust him, he said. Yes, she said. That's a complicated chain of trust, he said. It worked, she said. He almost smiled. It worked, he agreed. They reached the wagons. The group was organizing itself for the ride back. The particular cheerful noise of men who have come through something difficult and are on the right side of it. Doyle caught her eye from across the group and gave her a single nod. She returned it. Pete was there. He'd ridden in without making a production of it. And he looked at her from under his hat brim with the expression she'd come to know as his version of significant approval. She looked back at Ben, who was standing beside the wagon, watching her. You said you wanted to have a different conversation, she said quietly. When this was over. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It's over, she said. The words hung there between them, simple and direct, the way real things were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Not here. No, she agreed. Not here. They rode back to Black River Ranch in the middle of the group, surrounded by noise and relief and the sounds of men who had been part of something that mattered. The land spread out around them in the particular way of Montana at the turn of the season. Vast and demanding and beautiful in the way of things that don't care whether you find them beautiful. Clara sat in the wagon and felt the road under her, and thought about what was waiting at the end of it. Not the kitchen, though she would go back to the kitchen. Not the supply ledgers, though she would go back to those too. Something else. Something that had been building for 2 months and 11 days in the way that real things built. Slowly, in the margins of other work. In lamplight and doorways and conversations that were about one thing and also about something else entirely. She was not afraid of it. She had been afraid of enough things. She had earned the right to stop being afraid of the things that deserved better than fear. She watched the road and the land and the sky above Montana and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had placed her there, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had built her way into this place, piece by piece, day by day, with her own hands and her own mind, and the particular stubborn refusal to be less than she was. The ranch came into view. She looked at it. She still felt what she'd felt 3 days ago on the road back from the Saunders meeting. That shift in the chest, the thing she hadn't given permission for. It still looked like home. It looked like it more than it had before. She got down from the wagon and walked inside, and the kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, and she put the kettle on, because whatever came next was going to come after the men had been fed, and the day had been properly closed, and the work that was always there had been done. That was how she lived. That was how she had always lived. She heard Ben's boots on the porch. She kept her back to the door and her hands on the kettle and waited for what was next. I didn't come into the kitchen right away. She heard him on the porch, the particular sound of his boots stopping, then the quiet that meant he was standing there, doing whatever Ben Carter did when he was deciding how to enter a room. She had learned to read his silences the way she read everything else. This one was not hesitation, it was preparation. The door opened. She still had her back to him. The kettle was warming. She had her hands flat on the work table in the way she sometimes stood when she needed the solid feel of something beneath her palms. The men will want dinner, she said. Yes, he said. I'll start in a few minutes, she said. Clara, he said. She turned around. Howe was standing just inside the door, hat in his hand, and he had the look she'd been seeing more frequently in the last weeks. The open one. The one that sat outside his careful range. The one that made him look like the man he actually was, rather than the version of himself he showed to rooms full of people who needed managing. You found the coordinate error, he said. We've established that, she said. You found it, and you didn't tell me because you didn't want to disrupt Greer's timing, he said. We've established that too, she said. You trusted me enough to let me walk into that hearing without knowing the strongest piece of evidence we had, he said. Because you trusted that I trusted Greer, and you trusted Greer to use it right. She looked at him. It worked. It worked, he said. But that's not what I'm saying. What are you saying? She said. I was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands, once, twice, the way he did when he was choosing words with more than usual care. I'm saying that the level of trust that required, he said, is not the kind of trust that builds in 2 months between an employer and a cook. The kitchen was very quiet. No, she said. It isn't. He set his hat on the table. That was significant. She had noticed, over 2 months and 11 days, that Ben Carter put his hat down in a room when he intended to stay in it for a real conversation. It was a small thing. She had cataloged it along with everything else she cataloged about him, in the careful peripheral way she'd been doing since the first week. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want to tell it to you honestly, which means it may not come out the way I intend. Tell me anyway, she said. He looked at her directly. When I hired you, he said, I thought I was hiring a cook. I thought I was solving a kitchen problem. I looked at you standing in my doorway with your one suitcase and I thought, she's competent, she's direct, she's not afraid of hard work. I thought that was what I was seeing. And now, she said, now I think I wasn't seeing anything close to the whole picture, he said. Now I think that I have been watching you every day for 2 months, and I am still not certain I understand the full dimensions of what you are. And I have met a great many people in my life, Clara. I have not said that about many of them. She was very still. You don't have to say that, she said carefully. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I told you I wanted to have a conversation that wasn't about water rights, and this is that conversation, and I'm not going to handle it by being indirect about what I mean. She looked at him. She thought about 2 months and 11 days of parallel silences and lamplight, and the particular sensation of being seen accurately by someone who didn't need her to be smaller or simpler than she was. She thought about the morning with Blake's letter in her hand before she'd had her coffee. She thought about him sitting at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, saying nothing and making the silence feel like the most companionable thing in the room. She thought about every moment she had filed away and not allowed herself to look at directly, and she understood that he was asking her to look at them now. I'm going to say something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. All right, he said. I have spent most of my life, she said carefully, in situations where I had to earn the right to take up space. Not the literal space of a room, the kind of space that means being taken seriously, being included in the conversation, having my judgment trusted rather than tolerated. She kept her voice level. I have gotten very good at working within that. I have gotten very good at being patient and strategic and building things quietly and not asking for recognition I wasn't going to get. I was listening. He was doing that thing he did, receiving what she said without interrupting, without filling the space, without needing to respond before she was finished. This ranch, she said, is the first place in my adult life where I stopped doing that, where I said what I thought in rooms that weren't my room, and built things that weren't strictly my job to build, and pushed back on problems that weren't technically my problem to push back on. She paused. And nobody stopped me. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to. She looked at him steadily. That matters to me more than I can properly explain, she said. This place, what it became in 2 months, matters to me more than is strictly logical for a woman who came here with a suitcase and a determination not to beg anyone for anything. She stopped. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you finished? Yes, she said. Good, he said. Because I want to say something back. All right, she said. He took a step toward her, not closing the distance entirely. There was still space between them, but enough that the conversation became more direct in its geography. I have been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. I built it from a parcel of bad season land and one borrowed wagon and $1,100 I didn't entirely have, and I have been building it every year since. I know every foot of this property. I know every man on this payroll. I know the water table and the cattle yields and the county survey records and the personalities of 7 neighboring ranchers. He paused. I thought I knew what this place needed. And, she said. And then you arrived, he said. With your one suitcase and your supply ledger knowledge and your ability to see problems from every angle at once. And within 6 weeks, every man on this property trusted you more than they'd trusted anyone in years. And within 8 weeks, you had built a legal case that a county hearing officer used to refer Harrison Blake to the county attorney's office for fraud. Greer built the case, she said. Greer had the materials you gave him, Ben said. Don't do that. She stopped. Don't minimize it, he said. Not with me. You can do that in other rooms if you feel you have to. Don't do it in here. She felt something in her chest shift. The same thing that shifted when she looked at the ranch from the road 3 days ago, but sharper, more direct. All right, she said quietly. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, he said. You know that. You've been watching me for 2 months and you know that. I know that, she said. So when I tell you, he said, and his voice changed. Not softer, but more careful, more intentional, the way it got when he was saying something that mattered more than usual. That there is no version of this ranch going forward that I want to build without you in it. I need you to understand that I have thought about that. I have thought about it carefully. I am not saying it because you solved a legal problem. I am not saying it because you feed 22 men 3 times a day and do it better than anyone I've ever employed. I am saying it because you are the most complete person I have met in 11 years of building this life. And I would be a fool to let that go without saying so. The kitchen was completely silent. Clara looked at him. She had prepared herself. In the quiet way she prepared herself for things, for various versions of this conversation. She had thought about what he might say, and what she might answer, and how to be honest without being reckless, and how to protect herself while still allowing herself to be present in the moment. She had not prepared for that exact sentence. She had not prepared for the most complete person. She felt it land in her chest and stay there. Ben, she said. I know, he said. You're going to tell me that we work together, that you're employed here, that it's complicated. It is complicated, she said. Most things worth having are complicated, he said. That's not a reason. I'm also, she started. Don't, he said quietly. She stopped. Whatever you're about to say about yourself, he said, that you think is a reason I should reconsider. Don't. I know who you are. I have been watching who you are for 2 months. Whatever you think I might not have accounted for, I have accounted for. All of it. She looked at him. She thought about a lifetime of people looking at her and seeing a problem to be accounted for. She thought about every room she had stood in, where the calculation happened in 3 seconds before anyone had asked her a single question. She thought about Ben Carter opening a door 11 weeks ago and saying, "Come in." Just that. Come in. No calculation. Or if there was one, it had been made on different terms than anyone before him had used. I'm not going anywhere, she said finally. I told you that. I don't have anywhere to go, but that's not... She stopped. That's not why I'm staying. I want to be clear about that. I stopped staying because I had nowhere to go sometime around the 4th week. After that, I was staying because I wanted to. Something moved in his face, quiet and significant. I know, he said. I knew when it changed. She looked at him. You did? The morning after the storm, he said. When you told me about the creek and the supply drivers 7 years. You weren't giving me information because it was your job. You were giving me information because you cared what happened to this place. She was quiet for a moment. You noticed that, she said. I told you, he said. I watch things. She almost smiled. It was the first time in the last 10 minutes that almost smiling had felt possible. He took another step toward her. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, he said. I'm not asking for a yes or a no or any particular answer. I'm asking you to let this be something that exists between us, not in the background, not filed away somewhere. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking you to let it be real." She held his gaze. She thought about all the things she had filed away for 2 months. She thought about what it had cost her, across her whole life, to keep things filed away rather than let them be real. She thought about what it would mean to stop doing that. Here, with this man. In this kitchen that had become hers in ways she hadn't given permission for. "It's already real," she said quietly. "It's been real for a while. I've just been being careful with it." "I know," he said. "You can stop being careful with it." "That's not easy for me," she said honestly. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are. I'm just asking you to stop protecting yourself from something that isn't going to hurt you." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch. The men moving toward the bunkhouse, the cattle in the distance, the particular rhythm of Black River that she had learned so completely in 11 weeks that she could read the day by its sounds alone. "I need to start dinner," she said. He blinked. "Right now?" 22 men, she said. "They're going to be hungry after the ride." He stared at her for a half second, and then something broke open in his face. A real smile, the fullest one she'd seen from him, unexpected and unguarded. And it changed his whole face into something she hadn't quite seen before, and filed away immediately for permanent keeping. "All right," he said. He picked up his hat. "Clara," he said from the doorway. She had already turned to the stove. She looked back over her shoulder. "I'm glad I opened that door," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said. He left. She stood at the stove and put her hands on the surface and took one long breath. Then she started dinner. The meal that evening had a different quality than most. The men were still running on the energy of the day. The hearing, the outcome, the particular feeling of a thing resolved that had been hanging over the ranch for weeks. They were louder than usual and more generous with each other. And Henry told a version of events in the courtroom that was approximately 60% accurate but 100% enthusiastic. And even Pete contributed 2 complete sentences to the table conversation, which was unprecedented enough that Doyle marked the occasion by saying, "Lord, he speaks," and earning a look from Pete that could have stripped paint. Clara served and listened and said very little, but she noticed everything. She noticed the way the room had become, the ease in it, the specific ease of people who had been through something difficult together and come out on the right side of it. She noticed Henry's face when he told his story, and the way the men responded to him, with the warmth of people who had watched a young man find his footing and were glad to see it. She noticed Doyle's particular satisfaction, which was different from his early days' satisfaction, because it wasn't about himself. She noticed Pete finishing his plate for the first time in 3 weeks, which told her the tension of the situation had been costing him physically, whether he'd said so or not. She noticed Ben at the far end of the table. He was watching the room the way he always watched it, from his particular vantage point, with his particular stillness, taking in everything without making himself the center of any of it. But twice during dinner, his eyes found hers across the length of the table. The first time she looked away quickly. The second time she didn't. She held the look for one full breath and then went back to the kitchen, and she heard, distantly, behind her, the particular quality of silence that followed something that had been acknowledged. After dinner, after the cleaning, after the kitchen was settled and the lamp turned low and the house had gone quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She wasn't really drinking and thought about what had changed. Not what would change. What already had. She thought about the woman who had pulled a job advertisement off a board in Millhaven 11 weeks ago. The woman with $11.40 and one worn suitcase and a promise to herself that she would never beg anyone to see her worth again. She thought about what that woman had been willing to hope for. A place where what she could do mattered more than what she looked like doing it. That was all. That was the whole of it. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. She had found it. Not just found it, built it. Brick by brick, meal by meal, problem by problem, figure by figure on brown paper at a kitchen table by lamplight. She thought about what it meant that the man who owned this place had sat at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night for no reason, except to keep her company while she worked. She thought about the most complete person. She pressed her hand flat on the kitchen table. It was solid and worn and real under her palm. A knock at the exterior kitchen door. She already knew who it was. She opened it. Bun was standing on the step. No hat this time. His face was open in the way it had been earlier, and there was something slightly uncertain in it that she had not seen from him before. Not doubt, but the particular vulnerability of someone who has said a real thing and is waiting to understand what it cost him. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I wasn't sleeping," she said. He looked at her. Is it all right that I came back?" The uncertainty in his voice did something to her chest that she hadn't entirely prepared for. Because she had spent 2 months cataloging Benjamin Carter. His stillness, his precision, his economy of word, his particular quality of watchful intelligence. And she had not cataloged this. This was not the Ben Carter who managed rooms and read problems before they arrived. This was the man underneath all of that. The second son who had come west with what he could carry and figured out the rest. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." He let out a breath. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had laid out figures on brown paper, where he had sat with her in the lamplight, where everything between them had been built in the margins of other conversations. And he said, "I've been thinking about something you said earlier." "Which part?" she said. "The part about earning the right to take up space," he said. "About spending your whole life being strategic and patient and building things quietly without asking for recognition." She waited. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer," he said. "You can always ask me for an honest answer," she said. "Do you want to keep being the cook?" he said. She looked at him. "Explain what you mean by that," she said carefully. "I mean," he said, "that you have been managing the supply operations for this ranch for 11 weeks. You have been involved in legal strategy, community relations, financial analysis, and the management of a working group of 22 men who follow your direction without requiring you to have a title that justifies it." He paused. "I mean that the work you've been doing for 2 months is not cook's work. And you know that. And I know that. And I want to know whether you want that work to be what it actually is, officially, on paper, with the authority and the wages that should come with it." She was quiet. "You're offering me a position," she said. "I'm offering you the position you've already been doing," he said. "Ranch manager, household and operations, full authority over supply, budget, staff coordination, and external relations where relevant. Salary commensurate with the role." She looked at him steadily. "And the cooking?" she said. "We'll hire a cook," he said. "Unless you want to do both, in which case we discuss what that looks like." She thought about this. She thought about what it meant. Not just the title or the wages, but the acknowledgement of what she had actually been doing. The decision to make official and visible something that had been real for weeks in practice and unnamed on paper. "You thought about this before tonight," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," he said. "I didn't want to raise it before the hearing because I didn't want it to feel like a reward for the Blake situation. It's not a reward, it's a correction." She absorbed that. "A correction," she said. "Of an inaccurate job description," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had done in 11 weeks and the word cook at the top of the ledger page where her wages were recorded. And she thought about how she had never said anything about the distance between those two things, because she had been doing the thing she always did. Building quietly, not asking for what she wasn't sure she'd be given. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes to the position?" "Yes," she said again. "On one condition." "Name it," he said. "I want to keep cooking Sunday dinners," she said. "For the men. It matters to me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Done." They looked at each other across the table. She thought about everything it had taken to get to this table. The $11.40. The job board. The hotel and the boarding house and the dress shop and every room that had looked at her and calculated wrong. The 14 miles out from Millhaven. The first dinner. Blake's letter. The county documents. The hearing room. The most complete person. She thought about what she had promised herself. She would never beg anyone to see her worth again. She had not begged. She had simply shown it. Every day, in every room, in every meal and figure and document and argument and quiet act of building, until the right people could not fail to see it. "Ben," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me again," she said. "The other thing, not the position." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly and directly, the way he said everything that mattered, "Will you let this be real? You and me. Will you stop protecting yourself from it and let it be what it is?" She looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about Careful. She thought about everything. Careful had cost her, and everything it had protected her from, and whether, here, at this table, with this man, the protection was still necessary, or whether she had been carrying the shield so long she'd forgotten she could set it down. She set it down. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just his hand, warm and rough from 11 years of building, resting over hers on the worn surface of the kitchen table. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at him, and she thought that this was what it felt like. Not the version of this moment that stories made out of, with the grand gesture and the declaration and the sweep of music underneath. The real version. The version that happened in kitchens, in lamplight, after long days and difficult work, between two people who had been watching each other with care for long enough to know that what they saw was true. This was the real version. She turned her hand over under his and held it. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat at the kitchen table while the Montana night moved around the ranch and the fire in the stove ticked down and the sounds of 22 sleeping men drifted from the bunkhouse, and they were very quiet together in the way of people who had nothing left to be careful about. In the weeks that followed, Black River Ranch became something it had not been before. Not larger, not wealthier, though both of those things came in time. It became, more precisely, itself. The thing it had been capable of being all along, with the right people in the right roles, doing the right work with the right authority behind them. Clara took the position of ranch manager officially on a Wednesday morning, recorded in the ledger in Ben's handwriting, wages adjusted, title correct. She did not make an announcement. She did not call the men together. She simply began doing the work she had already been doing with the title and the authority that should have been there from the beginning. Doyle was the first one to acknowledge it. He came to her that Wednesday afternoon and said, "Heard about the title?" "Yes," she said. "Suits," he said, and walked away. That was all. Henry was less contained. He showed up in the kitchen. She was still in the kitchen, because Sunday dinners were hers and the rest of the week she was everywhere, and said, "Does this mean you outrank Doyle?" "The organizational structure of this ranch is something you should discuss with Mr. Carter," she said. Henry grinned. "That means yes." Pete said nothing. But he stopped by the kitchen on Thursday morning and left a small carved wooden figure on the work table. A horse, she realized, turned on its side so she'd see the detail of it. She didn't know when he'd made it or why he'd decided to give it to her that particular morning. She put it on the shelf above the stove. It stayed there. The county attorney's review of Blake's hearing complaint moved forward through the fall. Greer kept them informed. 2 of Blake's witnesses recanted their testimony. The co-complainant fraud was substantiated. By November, Blake had retreated from the Valley's major business dealings and was, by all accounts, engaged in a prolonged legal conversation with the county that showed no signs of resolving in his favor. Mrs. Alderton wrote Clara a letter in October. It was professional in tone and warm in substance. It said, among other things, "The county is better served by people who read documents carefully and act on what they find. I hope you continue to do so." Clara wrote back. A correspondence developed. She found, over the fall, that she had something she had not had before: professional connections. People who knew her name in the county context and associated it with competence. Ranchers whose wives wrote to her. The lawyer Greer who referred to her, in documents she later saw, as the analytical intelligence behind the Carter water rights defense. She thought about what the world would have said, 11 weeks earlier, about the cook at Black River Ranch having professional correspondence with county officials. She thought it would have said, impossible. She thought, and yet. The first real winter storm of the season came in late November, the kind that closed roads and required everyone on the ranch to work together with a precision and patience that left no room for anything but the task. Clara was in the middle of it the same as everyone, coordinating supply allocation, managing the indoor operations, keeping the heat and the food and the morale of 22 men stable through 4 days of serious weather. On the fourth night, when the worst had passed and the ranch was intact and the men were eating the best meal she'd managed in 3 weeks, because she'd been saving the good supplies for exactly this moment, Ben sat at the far end of the table and looked at her across the room. She looked back. He raised his coffee cup. Just slightly. Just enough. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to serving, because there was still work to do, and there was always work to do, and that was one of the things she loved most about this life. That there was always work, always something that needed building or managing or fixing, always a reason to be present and capable and exactly who she was. After the men had gone, and the kitchen was clean, and the house was quiet, Ben appeared in the doorway. "Come sit with me," he said. She took off her apron. She sat with him at the kitchen table, and outside the storm had gentled to something quieter, and the ranch sat under its first real snow of the season, and the fire in the stove burned warm and steady, and they talked about small things and large things, and the particular way that 4 days of a hard winter storm made you know exactly what you were made of. He told her about Missouri, more than he'd told her before, the older brother, the land that went to him by law and custom, the decision to go west as a young man and see what he could make of nothing. He told it plainly, without self-pity, the way he told everything. She told him about Laramie, about her mother and the long years of just the two of them, and what she'd learned about keeping things running when the resources were thin and the options were fewer than they should have been. She told it the same way, plainly, because she had learned from watching him that plainness was its own kind of strength. They talked until the fire needed stoking. Ben got up and stoked it. He came back and sat down and reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had that first night, simply, without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing. She thought it was. She thought it had become the most natural thing, in the way that all the things she had built here had become natural, not because they were easy, but because they were right. Because they fit the shape of who she was and who he was and what they were building together. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. He looked at her. "Stay," he said. "Not as the cook, not as the ranch manager. Stay, because this is your place as much as it's mine. Because you built it with me, even if you only arrived 11 weeks ago, and I don't want to build the rest of it with anyone else." She was very quiet. She thought about the job board. She thought about $11.40. She thought about a woman standing in the cold on a Millhaven street, folding a piece of paper into her pocket, making a promise to herself. She had kept the promise. She had built her way into a place where her worth was not a question. And now the man who owned the most land in the valley, the man who had watched her from the far end of the table and seen everything she was before she'd finished settling into the kitchen, was sitting across from her in the lamplight asking her to stay. Not as an employee, as a partner, as the person who would stand beside him while they built the rest of it. She looked at him. She thought about careful. She was done being careful. "I'm already staying," she said. "I've been staying since the 5th week. I just needed you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." "When did you know?" she said. "The morning after the storm," he said, for the second time. "When you gave me the creek information. You were protecting this place before you called it yours. That's when I knew." She held his gaze. Outside, the snow continued its quiet work on the Montana winter. The ranch was still and whole and holding. 22 men slept. The cattle were settled. The eastern section, with its water source and its surveyed boundary, sat intact under the first real snowfall of the season, defended and documented and safe. And inside the kitchen, that had been hers for 11 weeks, Clara Whitmore, the woman everyone underestimated, the woman who arrived with one suitcase and the refusal to be less than she was, sat across from the man who had seen her clearly from the first day and had never once asked her to be anything other than what she was. She tightened her hand in his. The fire burned, the ranch held, and the woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much and not enough, all at once, had finally found the place where the truth of who she was not only fit. It was exactly what was needed to make everything else work. She was not rescued. She was not discovered. She had walked through that door herself, done the work herself, built the case herself, held the line herself, and in doing so, had built something that belonged to her as completely as it belonged to the man sitting across the table. That was the difference between this story and every other story people tried to tell about women like her. Nobody gave Clara Whitmore a thing. She earned every inch of it, and everything that came after. The title, the partnership, the hand across the kitchen table, the life that spread out before her in the Montana winter, like land she had only just begun to understand how to farm. All of it was hers. Fully, finally, and without apology.